So let's take a look at Chapter 2, Lesson 1. So in class, I'm talking about how our test will come quicker. We took about 4.5 weeks before our first test in science over Chapter 1. But Chapter 2 is actually divided into two main sections. We have Lesson 1 and Lesson 2, which is talking about energy flow and different cycles that happen in our ecosystem. And that's what our second test is going to be over. Then when we get into lessons 3, 4, and 5, those are going to be looking at the different land biomes and the different types of water biomes. And I won't be testing you on those, even though I will be teaching them. So we're going to get started here. I would like you to follow along in your book. Make sure you're marking and highlighting if it's something that's in your book. And if it's not, and I'm sharing it with you, please write it down. So we're going to start on page 43, focusing in at the very top section. Find that in the very top section on page 43, there are two paragraphs. I want you to go to the second paragraph and the first sentence. It is the sentence before the bold print sentence, because that's what the first part of these notes is going to be about. It says an organism's energy role is determined by how it obtains food and interacts with other organisms. So we need to have the understanding that there are two things that are looked at by scientists that then classify all living organisms into a specific group. One, how they obtain food. That's the first thing that they look at. And then the second is how they interact with other organisms. So when we talk about organisms, once again, we're talking about biotic factors, anything that's alive, plant, animal, fungi, bacteria, all of those different categories. So when we start looking at 43, 44, and 45, we're going to see three different subheads or subtopics. They're kind of like a burnt orange color, like a reddish orange. But they tell us that we have three main roles that we're going to be looking at. We have producers, consumers, and decomposers. So the way I have my lessons planned out, the first day we're going to talk about producers, hopefully get through consumers and decomposers, on the second day. And that's where I'll end this particular video, and then we'll do the rest of Chapter 2, Lesson 1 on a second video. So looking at producers, the idea that the sentence tells us that energy enters most ecosystems as sunlight. So when you talk about yourself, taking notes, reading something, sitting there and just being able to breathe, and your heartbeat and carry blood throughout your body system, all of those functions that happen inside of your body take energy. And that energy inside of your body started out as sunlight. Now, we can't go outside in the sun like at recess and say, okay, sun, feed me. That doesn't work because that's not the way our bodies work. So we're not a producer, even though our energy also started as sunlight. So we have two different types of nuclear energy. The first being nuclear fission, and that's not on this slide, but just so you know what nuclear fission is. So nuclear fission is what the atomic bomb was based off of. Scientists figured out how we can take an atom and split the center of it, which is called a nucleus. And when they split that center, it caused a huge explosion. So the atomic bomb is the idea that we can drop a bomb designed to take a particular atom, and when it hits the ground or impacts something, it's going to cause the nucleus of an atom to split, giant explosion. The sun has just the opposite. It's not splitting atoms apart. It is forcing atoms together. So in the sun, it's made up of hydrogen and helium, and it forces those together to create a new compound. And when that happens, when these atoms are forced together, there's huge explosions. So in the sun, we get two different types of energy. Solar energy is what we're looking at when it comes to producers. We also have thermal energy, which is the heat that we get. We need the heat for the Earth to continue to support life. And then we also need the light in order for the Earth to continue to support life. So solar energy is just simply the light that's taking place. The light, therefore, is being absorbed by certain types of organisms, and those organisms are the producers. They can use the sunlight to create their own food. So a producer is simply an organism that creates its own food, makes its own food inside of itself. What we're talking about, therefore, are plants. Plants are green because they have chloroplast and chlorophyll inside of their cells, and those cells absorb sunlight. So notice down here at the bottom where this plant is, this is a math equation that I would like you to write down in your notes. So when I say equation, we often think of math, but math equations are also looked at kind of in science when we take substances and mix them together to get other substances or byproducts. So producers use sunlight, they absorb it in through their chloroplast and their leaves. It only happens in the leaves. Then they absorb carbon dioxide at the bottom of their leaves through an area called a stomata. It's basically little tiny holes that suck in and then exhale. So they're breathing in carbon dioxide. Once again, carbon dioxide comes from all animals when we exhale. And then they take in water from their roots and a little bit from their leaves. They mix those three things together. So the sunlight, the carbon dioxide, the water mixes together inside of their cells to create byproducts. That mixing to create something new is what the process of photosynthesis is. So we put an arrow to indicate the photosynthesis, and then we talk about the two products. The two main products created through photosynthesis is number one, glucose, which is what a plant uses as its food supply. And then it exhales, it gets rid of oxygen back through the stomata at the bottom of their leaves. When we talk about the glucose, just like you and I eat food and drink liquids to keep our entire body strong, the glucose that is created in the leaves keeps the leaves healthy. But they also pass it down the stems, to the trunks, to the roots, and all the parts of that tree use the glucose for it to stay healthy. We'll talk about the transportation of liquid and food inside of a plant a little later on in our books. But the cells of a plant are designed very specifically for this process. Our cells are not green. Your skin is not green because you don't have chloroplast and chlorophyll inside of your cells. These cells have these little itty bitty teeny tiny like solar panels. So if you know about solar panels, they're the large flat black things that absorb sunlight and create energy and electricity for people to use. These little teeny tiny chloroplasts are basically the same thing. The chlorophyll is the green liquid that is surrounding all the particles of the cell. The chloroplast then is those little bitty tiny cells that absorb the sun's energy and start storing and creating the glucose and getting rid of the oxygen. So then on the second day, we're going to be taking notes on consumers and decomposers. So you and I are a consumer. We're not a decomposer because it says it's an organism that cannot make its own food, but not only can it not make its own food, it has to consume. So when we look at Greek and Latin root words, then we have the Latin root consumere. It means to take up or take in, right? It means that you and I must eat in order to survive. We can't walk out in that sun and say, hey, feed me like the plant does. We have to start eating things. So we have some specific types of consumers that the book tells us about. We have an herbivore. It's not a herbivore. The H is silent. An herbivore, which only eats plants, right? In our area, we have a lot of very common herbivores that we see. And these are definitely not all of them. There are many, many herbivores in our area. When I look at an herbivore, they have a very specific type of teeth. They have teeth that are used to cut and grind, right? Most of the time, there's some type of incisor, which is sharp, or molar, which is very flat. When we look at other types, then we also have carnivores. And carnivores only have sharp teeth. They're designed specifically to eat meat. They don't go around looking for berries and grasses and flowers and things like that to eat. They're looking specifically for meat to eat. Notice on all of these, they only have sharp teeth. They only have incisors and what we call canine teeth, which come to a sharp point, because that's what they're interested in eating. That's what they are designed to eat. Then you have the omnivores. Well, that's you and I, right? We eat plants because we eat fruits and vegetables. We like to eat bread. right? All bread, such as bread itself and pastas, are made out of plants. But we also eat animals. We have chicken and we have pork and we have beef. So we have many different omnivores in our ecosystem and in our world. And they are designed to be able to eat all types of food. So when we talk about how this energy happens, then we have the sun that's going to begin the energy, always and forever. If we talk about food webs and food chains, it's always going to be that the sun begins the energy. It always starts out as light energy. That energy is then given to producers because the producers take it, they recognize it, and they're able to use it, and they change that sun energy into glucose. And then we have consumers that come along, and the consumers are going to eat the producers. So some of them are going to be herbivores that they only eat the plants. Some are going to be carnivores that only eat the herbivores, right? So still their energy started out from the plants, started out from the sun, went to the producers, went to the herbivore, and now, in this case, the wolves are eating the deer. And then omnivores are also going to get their energy directly from the sun. Their energy is either going to come from the meat, right? Or we also get it from the plants because we like to eat fruits and vegetables. So the energy that we get in order to sustain our life each and every day and all the processes that we do still began back at sunlight. When it comes to our different types of teeth then, such as omnivores, notice that the bear and the human mouth, we have all three types of teeth. We have incisors in the very front, which cut. We have molars in the back that grind. And then we have canine. Now, the bear's canine are definitely longer than ours, but we don't need to run along in the woods and bite our prey on the neck in order to kill it so we can eat it, right? So we don't need to have really sharp, long canines. But the carnivores, like the alligator, has all canine teeth. It's designed to grab, chomp, and then begin to tear their food up. While the zebra, the herbivores, they just have all molars because they're there to sit there and eat all the different types of grasses and plants and grind it up. So when we look at consumers, we cannot create our own food. Then we have some other categories. We have a specific type of carnivore that is a scavenger. And scavengers are organisms that are important to our ecosystems because when things like raccoons and skunks and possums are killed on the side of the road, if they were just left there and nothing happened to them, we'd be surrounded by dead carcasses, and that's really gross. So scavengers come along and they like to eat those dead organisms. So depending on where we are, we have different types of scavengers. We don't see hyenas in Indiana, right? But we definitely see the flies and the turkey buzzards. And in case you didn't know, maggots, which is in that bottom picture underneath the turkey buzzard, those are little baby flies before they change into a fly. Flies come along and lay their eggs, and when they're done eating on whatever the gross rotten thing is they're eating, then they lay their eggs and the maggots will hatch, and their first meal is going to be the same thing that the fly was on. Our last page then that we're going to cover in this video is decomposers. And decomposers is something that is also vital to our ecosystem. They're going to break down any biotic, once was living or is living, waste and material. So, I have a dog. He likes to make brown piles in my backyard. And if it's, not winter, then I just leave it there because there are organisms in my soil that want to have that to break down because that is their food. In the winter, not so much. I scrape it up and bag it and throw it away. But we have decomposers all over our world because they have to break down those things. Now, this is a word you should have learned last year in 5th grade. It has been on standardized testing over the past several years, so something I would like you to write down and make sure you know on page 45. The word is detritivore. Right? So we talked about carnivore, herbivore, and omnivore. Well, there's also a detritivore. And a detritivore is just the scientific term for a decomposer. It is an organism that feeds on the remains of dead organisms or the materials such as feces or poop, as we say when we go to the poop plant. That's their job, and that's what they survive off of. When we look at all the material that's left over, such as this log, so you might see fungus growing on it, you'll see insects in it and on it, because they're detritivores, and they break down the material that was originally inside of the tree. A fungi is notice not a producer. It is a decomposer. As I look at these fungi, the different mushrooms and toadstools, notice they're not green because they do not have chloroplast. They do not have chlorophyll. They are not a plant, even though a lot of people think a mushroom is a plant. It is not. It is a fungus. It's in its own category. It gets food through basically the roots of the fungi, and they absorb the material that's breaking down. Molds are also decomposers. When an orange, in this case, begins to rot, the mold's going to break it down quicker and dissolve the remains. The number one decomposer that we have that we don't see is bacteria. Bacteria is all around us, and it's so vital to our ecosystems and our world because there's so much waste and dead and decaying material around us that it's constantly breaking it down. And without them, nothing would really break down all the way. So those bacteria are vital to each and every one of us. All right, so we'll finish with these two questions. On page 45, it says to describe. It says an organism's energy role is determined by how it obtains blank and how it blank. That goes back to our first note, right? On page 43, how it attains food and how it interacts with other organisms. And then B says, what is the main source of energy for all three energy roles? I stressed it over and over and over again as I was going through this section, so hopefully you remember. That would be sunlight. So that is where we will stop this first video. Please make sure your notes are taken down, and then I will record the next video here in a couple hours when we have a break.